Welcome everyone to How Can Evidence-Based Policing Advance Police Reform Overseas, hosted by the Department of International Relations here at the LSE. I'm going to start with the conundrum. In 2015, an unarmed black man was shot dead in Cincinnati, and criminologist Robin Engel was appointed to lead the reform effort. Engel did what all good analysts do. She looked at the evidence based at what works to diffuse violence. And what she found was somewhat surprising. There's little conclusive evidence in support of the most tried interventions. These include body-worn cameras, training to de-escalate tense situations, and civilian oversight of the police. So here's the conundrum. If we don't know how to address a problem like police violence in the United States, where most research on police is, how can we do it elsewhere? So I'm Dr. Liam O'Shea at the LSE, where I lead the www.howtoreformthepolice.com project. The project's partners and I are developing a platform to synthesize the evidence on what works, where and why to reduce police violence and corruption, and to provide accessible guidance to police, activists, policymakers across the world. We're also currently looking for pilot funding, so if you're interested, have deep pockets, or know of someone who does, please look us up. Addressing police problems is different in different contexts, requires skills from different disciplines, which is why today I'm delighted to bring together our panel that includes leading criminologists and development practitioners. We have Dr. Rachel Kleinfeld, Senior Fellow in the Democracy, Conflict and Governance Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Police. Rachel is the author of the excellent Savage Order, which examines how the world's deadliest countries can forge a path to security, and which I thoroughly recommend to anyone interested in security in non-Western context. In addition to extensive knowledge of how to advance the rule of law abroad, which is also the title of one of her books, Rachel's recent work examines politicization of the rule of law in more established democracies. Professor Lawrence Sherman is the Wolfson Professor of Criminology Emeritus at the University of Cambridge, and the director of the Cambridge Centre for Evidence-Based Policing. He is widely credited as the founder of evidence-based policing for his pioneering work designing and conducting field experiments on policing across the globe. Lawrence is also the chairman of the US National Academy of Sciences Committee, which is currently examining factors across the globe which affect police legitimacy and the ability of police to promote the rule of law and protect populations. And its latest report will be published shortly. Ziyanda Stuurman is policy manager at the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, based at the University of Cape Town. Last year, she published her book, Can We Be Safe?, which examines the future of policing in South Africa. Her work has also examined policing in Latin America and elsewhere, including her most recent article on militarization of policing across the world. Now, we like to innovate at howtoreformthepolice.com, so we're going to take a slightly unusual panel structure. Our panelists will have about 5 minutes to discuss what are the causes of police-related problems in the global south. We'll then come round for a second pass, and they'll have about 10 minutes to examine how can these problems best be addressed. The session will end with Q&A, so we do keep some traditions. Please submit your questions via the chat function, and also, if you'd like, your name, affiliation, and so on. We also encourage you to join the debate online using hashtag LSE Police Reform. A recording will also be made available after the event, and hopefully a podcast too. So I think now all that leaves me to do is hand it over to Rachel to begin.
Thank you so much, Liam, and such a pleasure to be on this. I've been watching it for some time now. So the main causes of police-related problems in the global south, I think I'd like to actually talk about the main causes of police-related problems anywhere, rather than distinguish too much between the South and North. The US, of course, has its own problems. And I think I'll start with really the structure of the state. What are the police for in a state? If you look at Europe, it has strong states, and it had strong states before it had policing. And it had often disarmed the population before it had policing. It had very strong laws about who was allowed to bear arms. And they also had a civil service that grew. So the way that the state formed, you had a monarchy, as the nobles were replaced by a civil service that had to have some knowledge. the nobles sort of fought to get into the civil service by requiring the civil service to be educated. There's a whole literature on that. It's only useful here because by the time police came to be, what the world in which police came into was one in which they were expected to be a professional service with a great deal of knowledge and education. They often had national training academies with a lot of knowledge and education. And the population they were policing tended to be disarmed by monarchies and aristocratic norms, so that they weren't facing as dangerous a population. And that meant that by the time you got policing and democracy, the police were organized, educated, the norms against self-enrichment and so on. And the democracy of policing a community rather than a regime fit fairly easily into this training regimen. If you look at how a lot of other countries' police came to be, these were colonized countries. The police came to be in order to enforce the will of a foreign power and then of a regime that was often against the people, or to uphold a private law in which a certain segment of the population or a certain part of the regime was being privileged over another part. In these countries, when democracy came, if democracy came at the same time as statehood. And so you got patronage roles where democracy entailed giving away police jobs, often as patronage jobs. A lot of corruption. Corruption might have infused the force from the get-go because young men are a nice place to put a lot of patronage roles and also a lot of places for regime protection. So you got a lot of roles that were purchased. Often that corruption had to go up in a kind of pyramidical scheme where you buy your job and you have to push it up, the money up to the top. That builds norms of an extractive state right into the policing structure. So before you look at what are the problems of police, you have to look at the structure of the governance of the state, how these police form. And the US, by the way, really falls in between these two. Our democracy came at the same time as our state. We had extremely corrupt policing in our municipalities. The machine-controlled police were big places for patronage hires, and the Southern police, you know, the issues there are well known for upholding a privileged structure. And the original functions of police in terms of protecting power holders in the South are well known. So when your police are seen as symbols of a state that is primarily predatory or extractive or highly unequal, it's really hard to build trust. And policing depends on trust. It depends on community trust to just tell the police what the problems are, among other things, because we know that the police really can't find out what the problems of crime are frequently unless the community tells them. But if you're the first rung on a patronage ladder, or it's really about a political party gaining power, these jobs are going to certain people whose goals are not about gaining the trust of their community. Their goals are elsewhere. Or if the government itself is tied to organized crime, or the governance system itself is corrupt, the police may just be a portion of that, whose job is really about regime protection or protecting a portion of that regime. So if you have a force, which, you know, like a lot of forces, 10% really good people and incorruptible, 80% are going to go whichever way the institution goes, and 10% really care a lot about power and might be particularly willing to use violence to do that. The norms of the institution that shape those 80% have a lot to do with the governance norms and the criteria by which the governance norms are set. So you can try to fix the policing problem, but really you need to start with the norms of the state and reorienting the structure of government in which the policing structure sits. And I'll just stop there.
Thank you very much. That was great. Over to you, Lawrence.
I would agree with everything Rachel said, and perhaps try to focus on just some of the dimensions that she emphasized, particularly because the idea of evidence-based policing, as advertised for the seminar, depends on knowledge, which itself depends on literacy. So I would like to emphasize the role of education, if not so much a cause by its absence, a cause of police problems around the world, global South and to some extent global North. But the broader issues of enlightenment with respect to rational analysis of cause and effect, and the ever-present battle over things like vaccines, treatments for various diseases, which cause as much controversy, in some cases more, than police do in certain contexts of global South nations. And to the extent that the battle over use of systematic and scientific evidence in designing police strategies, in trying to minimize the use of force that police deploy in the United States or in South Africa, to the extent that research is part of the solution, it faces anti-scientific attitudes as part of the problem. And those scientific or anti-scientific attitudes are highly linked to not just illiteracy, but even to educational levels that are minimal and dominated by the authority structure of knowledge, believing things to be true based on who tells you it's true, rather than through independent thought. And the challenge for police institutions in this context is that many police officers in the global North and the global South are very committed to policing by experience, by emotion, by issues around respect for police and challenges to police power, rather than trying to approach policing as a public health issue in which the primary purpose is prevention. The primary methods have to do with understanding epidemiology of violence problems and how that epidemiology informs interventions that can be tested through rigorous trials using random assignment in many cases, but in any event, trying to identify causal relationships rather than working with spurious and prejudiced assumptions in many cases that target vulnerable groups, not always minorities. Certainly women aren't minorities, but they are very often disadvantaged by police in both global North and South. And to the extent that the problem of education pervades things like birth rates and indeed gender ratios, with more deaths of young female babies, education seems to be a master variable for building the kinds of societies on principles of equality and human rights that we would all like to see. But I would concur with Rachel that we've got to get to having those kinds of societies as the foundation for having the police that we want for such a world.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. And now over to Ziyanda.
Great. So good evening, everyone, from a very warm and balmy Cape Town in South Africa. If you'll allow me to, I'm going to be a little bit philosophical and a little less practical in my answer to this question, because I think this one question asks a lot of other larger framing questions too. So very much like Rachel, I found it really interesting to think about this question and to come up with a succinct answer, because both of the terms overseas and global South in the title of this panel discussion and in the question that's just been posed aren't actually terms that I often use to describe South Africa, our neighboring countries, or the work that I do on crime and violence prevention at an academic institution. So in working through this particular question and through those terms of what the main causes of police-related problems in the global South are, I found it much more useful to start at the very origin of policing institutions, which is of course colonialism, and thinking about how, if at all, police institutions have changed as much as the societies they operate in have. Of course, I can't speak to every country overseas or in the global South, but the two countries I've written about and researched, namely Brazil and South Africa, both have similar histories of colonialism, slavery, racism, racial capitalism that depended on enforcement by police forces. Those same police forces or institutions worked for hundreds of years to suppress and repress liberation movements. They upheld fascist and dictatorial regimes, and they practiced a form of policing that continuously reminded people of their place in their country's social and economic order. Much of that is true for many other countries like Brazil and South Africa, and that is precisely why policing in those countries is problematic at best. The history of violence and brutality is also often the basis for the lack of legitimacy that police institutions face in this sort of nebulous overseas and global South. And as Johnny Steinberg describes the policing situation in South Africa in the early 2000s, barely a decade after the formal end of apartheid, many South Africans did not give their consent to being policed by the newly minted South African Police Service, and rather resentfully learned to live with those police officers in their communities, occasionally calling on them when harm was perpetrated or disputes needed settling. So that history, that colonial history of policing that facilitated exploitation, brutality, and propped up brutal regimes is also the source of an ongoing lack of accountability within police institutions. Legal policing reforms, such as a repeal of the legislation that gave the police in Kenya and Nigeria their mandates, and their replacement with legislation focused on community policing and human rights, have had a limited effect on changing this. A very recent and painful reminder of these limits has been the NSA's popular movement in Nigeria against police brutality and corruption, as well as the harsh police and military enforcement of COVID-19 pandemic restrictions in Angola, Uganda, Kenya, Brazil, Mexico, Peru, India, and other countries. Across 34 African countries surveyed by the public opinion polling think tank, mouthful, called Afrobarometer, both before and after 2020, a trend of declining levels of trust in the police and increasing levels of perceived corruption has been observed. Much of what is problematic about the police has also been the cause of popular discontent, and that has placed citizens at odds with the police on their street and in their communities time and time again. And it bears mentioning that the global social and economic shocks of the last 2 decades, never mind the last 2 years, have only worsened what already existed in many countries. So those unresolved issues of the past haunting police institutions in post-colonial societies routinely manifest in a lack of accountability, a distinct lack of political will to end police brutality and police violence, and instead the weaponization of the police against the people. And lastly, also to an ever wider rift between citizens and police institutions with a sometimes tenuous claim to legitimacy. So I'll stop there in my sort of opening remarks, and I look forward to a conversation around addressing these issues.
Thank you very much, Ziyanda. Well, we've begun to unpack quite a complex question, and with complex causes and big causes. So now turning to round 2, where you have to turn that around and look at how we might go about addressing police problems. So back to you, Rachel.
Sure. So we actually know quite a lot about what works to do better policing. At least we know quite a lot in the global north. A lot of that has to do with Lawrence's work, actually, over decades to codify knowledge and slowly put it together, research he's done or research he's catalyzed. And so while we know a lot about hot spots, hot heads, all things like this, how to get it done is the issue. How do you get police who often don't want to accept this science, want to focus on more rule of thumb rather than kind of statistically based methods and so on, to accept it and implement it? That's really the issue, whether it's kind of a cultural norm within the department or whether it's a political issue or a governance issue. How to get the evidence taken up is a real problem. I started with trust, and I want to start with that again, because vast quantities of research suggest that trust is so essential because controlling crime requires public support. In the US and UK, upwards of about 90% of the crimes people fear most, rape, homicide, things like this, require public tips to solve. It's not as if the police are there catching folks in flagrante all the time. But what's interesting is your question had been, what achieves better police? Better policing is hard to say, because the metric about bringing down crime is not necessarily what builds trust. People feel more trust based on respect and fairness, procedural matters. Tracy Mears at Yale has done a lot of work on this kind of procedural policing. Respect and fairness doesn't necessarily bring down crime immediately, but it does bring about trust. Trust is also enhanced by recruiting a force that's more diverse, that looks more like the community. Sorry, I shouldn't say more diverse, that looks more like the community it serves. But diversity doesn't necessarily affect police violence, or at least might hit a tipping point. But so there are a lot of different metrics that are pretty nuanced in whether they affect policing and make it better. Women in law enforcement, more women does seem to result in more trust and less corruption. But that's a pretty small number of studies. Lawrence and Powell might have done, Jay Powell might have done more than I've seen, but better is a pretty big category. But if you're looking at trust, that has a lot to do with procedural measures, things like respect and fairness, even if you're actually ending up arresting people, then you can do things that work, but you have to have a policing agency that wants to use focused deterrence, that wants to use hotspot policing, that wants to use methods of statistical analysis to focus on the small percentage of people that commit the vast majority of crime and the small number of places it tends to happen. Getting police to make these changes has to do a lot with the structure of society. I'm sorry, I go back to this a lot. And that has to do with how much crime there is. When you've got a moment of low crime, you can tend to get more reform. That's what we saw in the United States. It's what we see in other countries as well. But often the first move goes to the criminals. So when you start getting high levels of crime, and it starts touching the people with the most voice in society, politicians are pushed to act. And often the way that they act is that the middle class, or the people with the most voice, depending on the structure of society, vote for more repression. They vote for more law and order, mano dura, and so on. So what you need is either in a moment of low levels of violence and crime, or at a moment where there's high violence and crime and people are paying attention, for a social movement to say, actually, mano dura is going to make the situation worse. Reams of research suggests that more police brutality is going to lead to more violence and crime. Locking up mass numbers of youth hardens gangs, helps criminals learn from each other, and so on. Nobody cares about the statistics. I've done years of my life was working in the political sphere. You don't convince people in politics through statistics. So you really need sort of a social movement to get people to change their minds. But if you can get that social movement and get people to vote for different policies, or put pressure on politicians for different policies, and then those politicians actually care about hiring the technocrats to do different work, then you can get change. And then comes the decisions about what to do. And this is where so much of Lawrence's work suggests there are all these policies that can work. And reform often gets bogged down here over because of unions, things about firing and so on. And these are hard questions. Some places decide to fire large numbers of their police, and that can work, actually. There's credibility behind that. It can also lead to large numbers of police going into criminal gangs. A lot of that has to do with what happens after you decide to fire or decide not to fire large numbers, which is about accountability and follow-up. Colombia fired in the mid-90s large numbers of its police to try to clean up, but then had almost no accountability and follow-up, and the police just reorganized in another kind of corrupt cycle. Whereas in the Republic of Georgia, they fired large numbers of police and then had very stringent accountability, in which people on the customs shift, for instance, customs and border was particularly problematic, as they often are. If there was any case of corruption found, the whole shift would be fired. So they held each other accountable. But then you started to move toward more authoritarian sorts of governance, and you had other problems like overfilling jails and so on that led to a different sort of problems. So these things, it's not about one way or the other. It's about finding this easy middle and paying a lot of attention to the stats and what's going on. And the public tends to lose interest. So you have to keep keep at it with watchdog organizations and so on that are paying a lot of attention. The other thing I'll say is that police reform really can't be all stick and no carrot. There is no organization that I've ever seen as good as police organizations in slow walking reforms, whether it's willful subversion, whether it's half-hearted implementation. Deep reform really requires police to accept change or to want change. They can't be the enemy. And they really shouldn't be the enemy. I mean, even in the countries where the police are incredibly violent and brutal, they often are also the target of a huge amount of brutality. And I think it's really important for activists and reformers to recognize this. I started my career doing PhD research in Indonesia, working on police brutality and interviewing real low-level police. And they almost wept during my interviews because they were forced by hire. First of all, they were living in just god-awful conditions, just, rat-infested, vermin-infested, just really disgusting. And they're young men and they're away from their families. They're often not much older than kids themselves. They're being forced to shake down people because they have to pass the money on up. They're often getting brutalized by people above them, often quite violently. These are not happy people, and they're passing that on to others in the community. A little bit of understanding of the situations that they are in. I was stunned at how much information I got out of them just by showing a little empathy for their situation. And so understanding what they need to make their daily lives better is important. Hans Tack, who is a scholar in America in the 70s, found that in the US, when police were afraid but couldn't admit it, those were the police that were most brutal. And I think it is likely that similar forces psychologically exist all over the world. That seems to me a likely psychological reality, although I haven't seen that kind of work. Certainly, I have seen cross-country work that suggests that where populations are armed and murder rates are high, police are more brutal. And that correlation suggests that whether it's that police are scared or that populations give their police more latitude to use force when they know that the population is violent, one or the other or both, you're getting more brutal police when their jobs are in fact more dangerous or feel more dangerous to them or are ginned up as dangerous by police training and so on. All of those things suggest that trying to find ways as reformers that we can work with police and help them solve the problems that are in their daily lives so that they can then do a better job. That 80% that really wants to do a better job, but they're not going to stick their necks out and lose their job over it, is the best way to move on the how of reform. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Lawrence, over to you now.
Let me take Ziyanda's point about the colonial origins of most of the global South countries that this seminar should be talking about, and the important implication of colonialism that is probably overlooked about the role of the police in protecting the public from harm, because that never was the role of the colonial police. The colonial police were there to protect the colonial entrepreneurs who were making money out of these countries, who had communities of managers to protect, and who had public order issues to worry about in the main streets of the big cities, to the point where basically the model that the British police handed over in India, where I've spent a lot of time in the past decade, the model they handed over was described as fire brigade policing. That the police spent all their time in the station houses unless they had to go out to accompany VIPs on particular journeys. And if there was a riot, they would go out as a fire brigade. But with respect to the idea that we have in the global north of picking up a phone and dialing a 3-digit number, and the police are going to send a police car, that just was never a kind of customer service model that I've seen colonial police forces develop in the decades since the end of colonization. Why is that important? I think it's important very much for police legitimacy, because there's not even a kind of pretense that we are here to serve the public. The emphasis in the officer corps such as the Indian Police Service, which is chosen by competitive examination from hundreds of thousands of applicants. And they appoint 150 new police chiefs every year who will spend the next 30 years in that command of 2 million constables, most of whom are terribly paid and not well treated, depending on the state in India. But what's fairly common across India is the slow transition from a reactive fire brigade, stay in the police station model, living in the police station, theoretically without any days off, 365 days a year, but not until very recently, routinely doing patrols of the kind that Robert Peel envisioned for the London police before the Indian Police Service was even created, with the idea that you would protect the public through the utilitarian theories of deterrence and crime prevention in the Peelian principles as they've been translated down the years was more important than punishment. So this is not what we know from colonial policing, and one way to perpetuate, as Ziyanda was saying, one way to perpetuate the lack of legitimacy of a colonial police force is to have the indigenous population take it over and operate it in exactly the same way. What that raises is this idea that certainly became very current after the murder of George Floyd, much more stick than carrot, of course, with the idea of not only defunding the police, but as Alex Vitale's book said, the end of policing. So there's two issues there. One is, can we imagine a high crime society like the United States, or potentially like many parts of India, getting by without a police force, and by the same token, without the army coming in and doing what the British Army did in London after 3 days of rioting, which was to shoot to death 300 to 700 people. The count was never very precise. But Peel, among others, said, we don't want the British Army treating the British people as the enemy. Whereas in the colonial terms, that was a kind of confrontation. And actually, one of the things that changed Gandhi's whole approach to independence in India was the slaughter of Indian constables in a police station in the north of India in the early 1920s. What is it that you can do with a former colonial police system, which has now persevered 70 years or more in most places? And the answer might be drawn from some success stories in which, not by firing police officers, but by making a gradual transition, as in Northern Ireland, from the Royal Ulster Constabulary, 95% Protestant, pretty strong anti-Catholic attitudes. It's now I think a 55% Protestant organization. It's called the Police Service of Northern Ireland. And it managed, through the guidance of current Chancellor of Oxford University, experienced diplomat and civil servant, who built a strategic plan for slowly making a transition from an old police force to a new police force, a police force that previously had been the colonial police force of Ireland, with Great Britain colonizing Ireland and ruling by force, and which became a police force for Northern Ireland with all of its internal conflicts and disputes, but one that was dedicated to promoting peace to the extent possible, given lingering anger over previous violence of at least 30 years leading up to the Easter agreements. What the Police Service of Northern Ireland did doesn't seem to be much by way of former colonial policing in the global South, but it's been echoed in Camden, New Jersey, where a pretty brutal city police force was absorbed by a very enlightened county police force that was led by a chief who promoted Hippocratic policing and trying to emphasize the minimization of harm and not to have police cause more harm than they were trying to prevent. But all with a very proactive public health intervention model that is aimed at making the protection of the public its primary purpose. And I don't think, for the most part, colonial police forces have made the transition into protecting the public as opposed to protecting the VIPs. And a good part of the reason for that is the VIPs who are in charge of the police and who appoint the police leaders. And why would they want to give up the kind of privilege that the colonial masters had? And in some parts of India, the idea that the Maharaja, the local potentate who had been eliminated by the 1947 independence, was replaced not by some Indian elected official, but actually by the police themselves, and certainly in terms of certain corruption flows of money from criminals. It had gone to the Maharaja, and now it was going to the police. So this whole transition from the colonial period to the modern period, I think, is incomplete. It may have some opportunities in it for redesigning or reinventing a police service. I don't see any countries in the global South that are talking about making a gradual transition to build a new kind of police service to replace the old kind of police service. But I think more than the specifics of strategy and tactics for evidence-based policing is this question of a political strategy for building a new police institution as an Enlightenment project, distinct from a force of oppression for extracting large amounts of money that came out of the British colonies and which built lovely buildings all over England that we're still enjoying, but which in some sense we need to make reparations for by having, as we now have this year, increasing numbers of students from those same countries, which leaves us in a position as we think about plan and how a plan for the different contexts, depending on levels of literacy, the kind of economy, the extent of the digital and transportation infrastructure, and even reforms like all women's police stations in India, which resulted, according to recent research, in women going to police stations being told that their crime was gendered, and so they'd have to go 20 kilometers to another police station that was for women. So with all good intentions, they made it much more difficult for women as victims of crime in trying to, if you will, modernize by being more inclusive or more sensitive to those issues. I don't think piecemeal solutions like that are as likely to produce a fundamental change in the mission and values of a police institution as building something side by side. And many nations have multiple police services now. And so one policy I hope will get more consideration from the various donor nations supporting police development in overseas countries. One idea is to try to build a new police service side by side with whatever police force there is, and ultimately to make the transition from a police force where you could not hire new people and just let the ones who are working there retire. So without firing lots of people who then become part of the problem, you let them continue and have that side of policing slowly disappear and build the more trustworthy, supportive, polite and considerate police culture that is much closer to what you see in Britain and Europe today.
Thanks very much, Lawrence. Now, over to you to say, Emma.
Great. So, I mean, firstly, I have to say, I think Liam has obviously done a great job of pulling this panel together, because I'm going to hit on a lot of the notes that both Rachel and Lawrence have spoken about and in sort of slightly more detail. So given the main causes of police-related problems that I identified in my first answer, I think it's useful to think of ways of addressing these problems as those that exist to work within the structure of police institutions and those that exist outside of those structures. So firstly, within police institutions, there's obviously a fairly large body of evidence in criminology and economics that demonstrates that policing has a deterrent effect. In other words, criminal behavior is generally reduced by increases in policing presence, either through larger deployments or increased intensity of police presence. So I know that in many countries in the global north and elsewhere, crime levels have been on a downward trend for many years, and that often has nothing to do specifically with police presence, but I'm specifically, just sort of more pointedly referring to those countries that still struggle with high rates of violent crime. So it's for this reason and many others that a country like South Africa invests heavily in visible policing strategies with police officers in vehicles and on foot in public space, as well as the collection of crime statistics for trend analysis. So in South Africa, again, and other countries, the popular strategy, of course, of identifying hotspots is also often used. And across several of those countries, when police officers and communities work together to fill public space with outdoor markets or other large neighborhood activities in previously dangerous and deserted areas, crime levels eventually decrease. In this way, that elusive practice of community policing that so many police institutions say they do, but not all actually do, also serves as a deterrent to crime as it brings communities into closer contact with the police and facilitates improved relations. It builds broken or non-existent trust because of colonial history, and it opens channels of communication that didn't exist before. Interestingly, evidence from the US and the UK has also found that community policing is more effective at improving perceptions of police legitimacy than actually reducing crime. So not to belabor the point, but to me, this is at least a clear sign of the distinction that sometimes exists between what community policing is and the practice thereof in the global north and in the global south and across geography. Also, interestingly, in countries with more fragile security infrastructure or settings, evaluations that have been led by Robert Blair, Sabrina Karim, and Benjamin Morse in Liberia, as well as Jasper Cooper in Papua New Guinea, have found that increasing community police relations and interactions can lead to a rise in reporting crimes, particularly from those who are disadvantaged by traditional forms of dispute resolution. In Liberia, so-called confidence patrols in rural communities did little to increase trust in the police as a whole, but they did improve knowledge of the law, they increased crime reporting, and they reduced the incidence of simple assault and domestic violence. In Papua New Guinea, a permanent community police officer was introduced into villages in rural Bergenville, where previous police contact had been limited. This police presence led to increased demand for both police and traditional dispute resolutions, with women actually preferring police presence, and reduced community perceptions of the prevalence of crime. Lastly, in this realm of working within police institutions, the composition of police teams may sometimes influence the ability of the police to respond to the needs of marginalized groups, especially women, but has its limitations, as Lawrence mentioned earlier. Efforts to also better integrate female officers into the police service in many countries have ranged from purely cosmetic to more strategic or operational approaches. And such as in Papua New Guinea, research there found that the introduction of a permanent police presence led to increased crime reporting by women, especially when the police officer on duty was female. So building on semi-experimental evidence from India, and it also found a rapid expansion in all women police stations. This led to a 22% increase in the reporting of crimes against women. And currently, 2 ongoing studies are testing the effect of providing specialized training and resources specifically to female officers. So those are, again, just some sort of quick reflections on evidence that's been collected by JPAL as well as researchers through the EGAP network. And there's plenty of literature that's available on these sort of methods. But there is also a healthy sort of literature bank on the other sort of example of work that I'd spoken about earlier. That's about working outside of police institutions. So I work day to day on a project in South Africa, particularly aimed at violence prevention, that really has very little to do with the police, and that's for multiple reasons that I won't necessarily delve into right now, but based on, again, a large amount of evidence that shows that violence prevention that takes a long-term look at essentially what's happening in a lot of communities, and actually proposes a cognitive behavioral therapy inspired approach to reducing violence, sometimes in schools and sometimes with out-of-school youth. So studies in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, school-based studies have shown that having mindfulness practices and psychosocial support available to students who are in communities with high levels of crime, particularly violent crime, helps to disrupt cycles of violent behavior or antisocial behavior that can morph into larger crime trends in the future. Similarly, in Liberia, a study with young men between the ages of 18 to 26, working at reintegrating young men who were involved in a lot of illicit activities, that has found over a period of time that cognitive behavioral therapy inspired approaches, as well as in some circumstances, cash transfers, allow those young men to move from illicit activity to more formal activities that are socially integrated, and allow them to, in many ways, form productive parts of society in a way that their previous lives would not have allowed them to do. And lastly, a piloted program, again, that I'm working on in South Africa and a lot of communities that are affected by gang violence, also is trying to look at the impact of psychosocial support within schools, and particularly within the context of COVID, that has really led to a large amount of grief and trauma, or sort of incidents of grief and trauma because of children losing parents to the pandemic, but also because of disrupted school cycles that have obviously severely affected psychosocial relationships as well. So there again is a lot that I think is being done and can be done within police institutions, but also within communities that is meant to, in many ways, change our ideas of what, whether it's police and community relations or community relations that reduce the need for the police to actually be in communities themselves.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you to all three of you. Really fascinating stuff and much we can further unpack through Q&A. So I'm going to jump straight into the first question, which is from Rebecca, a master's student at the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. And the question is, what are some examples of successful or unsuccessful community policing initiatives / indigenous policing systems? What makes them successful or unsuccessful? And how are they different from colonial policing systems? I'll give Ziyanda a little bit of time to catch her breath, and then so I'll go to Lawrence, then we'll go to Ziyanda, then to Rachel.
Well, in the global north, there's precious little evidence that community policing is effective in reducing crime. Mixed evidence about improving trust in the police. One of the experiments we did in Houston in the early 1980s showed that if the police go into neighborhoods, knocking on doors, introducing themselves, saying, we're the new police officers in this beat area, we just want to get to know you. Follow-up surveys we did showed that for the white American-born residents whose doors they knocked on, they were very happy to know the police were there and to meet the police. For recent immigrants from Vietnam and Mexico, they were terrified. And they had no idea why the police were knocking on their door, but they knew it wasn't good, at least given the perspective that they had. And the lesson we tried to learn from this is that this idea of community ties and building communications between police and members of the community may be a kind of what was the children's show with the we know the people in the neighborhood, and the American generation of children raised to believe that neighborhoods are benign places where everybody's nice and interacts with each other. not Sesame Street, but the same generation.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers. Thank you, Rachel. I don't think that we can build community policing programs around the idea of Mr. Rogers' neighborhoods. We've got lots of communities with lots of conflict, with lots of violence, and lots of reasons for people to be afraid of each other. And to promote that particular view of crime prevention in the absence of good experimental evidence of it in the United States, as many former United States police professionals do, because they have a consensus that community policing sounds good and ought to be pushed, is a problem, especially because it bundles together lots of different tactics and strategies. And what we ought to be doing is taking those apart and thinking separately about each one of those, just like you might have different strategies and tactics for public health that might involve water, might involve sanitation, facilities in addition to clean water, and so on. We have, I think, very good reasons to believe that there can be successes from police trying to promote peace among warring factions and restorative justice, in particular at the level of the individual offender and the criminal, in both traditional societies like the practice of the Maori in New Zealand, on which the Australian models that Heather Strang and I tested in Canberra in the 1990s, and then on in London and other English settings. The evidence there is very strong that under a well-prepared setting, police officers promoting dialogue between the victims and their family members and the offenders and their family members about a specific crime. And that gives everybody a stakeholder reason to be there, because they're all affected by the crime through their relationship either to the victim or the offender. And everybody tends to come together in ways that were originally modeled by indigenous customs in New Zealand and then spread into the global north. So it's a really good example of what turns out to be, under rigorous testing in 12 randomized controlled trials, a very effective practice that sadly has lots of evidence but no support. It doesn't fit into the rubric of what people go around sloganeering about community policing, even though in a way it's a building of community by the police that not only prevents crime by the offender in the future, but also reduces trauma and serves as a kind of cognitive behavioral therapy for the victim and the victim's family. So we do have continued problems with the disjunction between evidence and practice. But if you ask me for a success story in something that involves the police working with the community, that's the best thing I can point to. And I don't think it's been picked up even in countries in Africa where those kinds of meetings have a very long tradition. But in fact, if you read some of the literature from the mid 20th century, the police in effect replaced all that with the courts, with the magistrates, with the prisons, and it became the British justice rather than community justice. Now that these communities are no longer British, maybe it's time to go back to what was working probably pretty well in terms of keeping the peace and trying to prevent blood feuds that go on for years, if not generations.
Thank you, Lawrence. Rachel, yes.
Sure. So I'll just add a few. Lawrence covered the gamut pretty well, but I'll just add a few things. So first of all, as Lawrence was saying, community policing is really one of these catch-all terms. I mean, I remember going around Chile and Colombia and all over Latin America, and everyone said they were doing community policing. Everyone was doing something different. Most of them weren't doing anything even vaguely similar to what the evidence, the small bit of evidence that we have on community policing talks about in terms of the tactics. So it's one of these terms that, especially once you get down to implementation, as opposed to what community policing say they're doing. So there's the what are the tactics, then what do they claim that they're doing, and then what are they actually doing on the street? You lose so much at each level that it's really not particularly useful, even the little bit that it was in the first place. second of all, I would say that your question had to do with indigenous policing systems. Here I get really quite concerned because I think Lawrence was talking about indigenous reconciliation practices, and there is good evidence on that. I know more of the conflict world on that than the policing world, but the two are somewhat similar, that reconciliation practices that bring the two sides together in these ways that bring the community together do have a track record. Indigenous policing practices lean very quickly into vigilantism. And if you think policing is bad, vigilantism gets worse really quickly. And it gets worse even when you're talking about groups that look like Neighborhood Watch or what have you that appear fairly benign in the global South context. Once you start empowering people to carry out their own justice, even the groups that start out fairly positive, and some do, some definitely start out desirous to protect their communities. The people attracted to those jobs turn. There are groups that are interested in infiltrating those, and we see this even in the global North. Minneapolis had a big defund the police movement after George Floyd. You quickly saw good guy vigilantes come in to protect the protesters who didn't want the police anywhere near them. Very quickly, you got drug dealers coming in to infiltrate those vigilante or those good guy groups, and then vigilantes who nobody knew who they were, armed because it's the US context and we have millions of guns running around. So this trajectory you see very quickly in countries that have indigenous policing traditions. In Nigeria, for instance, what you tend to see is good guy groups that get infiltrated, they get used by political parties to carry out their missions. And then pretty quickly, you just have a lot of different armed groups. And one thing we know about multiples of armed groups is that they make situations more violent and worse. I also just wanted to put just two fingers on, I can see from the questions, a lot of people are frustrated by two things that we're doing. One is our continual, all of us talking about colonialism, and second, by all of us talking at this very high level of trust and the structures of the state and so on. Let me just say the reason we're talking about colonialism, and I will speak for myself, but I think that my fellow speakers will agree. First of all, it's not actually that old, depending on your country. It's from 20 to 60 years old or 70 years old. That's well within the lifetime of many people. But equally important, many of the structures are exactly the same or very, very similar because the organizations of policing, as Lawrence said, really fit the new governments that took over after colonialism. And a lot of those regimes didn't want to give up those structures that protected them. And so even though we're in a post-colonial period, the structures of policing lasted. And so we're talking about those structures because they're similar or the same as those structures that existed before. And so we're dealing with those structures. And why are we talking about these really high level abstract things rather than just getting down to basics and telling you what works? And I think the reason is that Peter Drucker, the management scientist, said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think within policing organizations, we can tell you what works, but like the community policing phrase, it will then get distorted through the sort of funhouse mirror of what police actually want to do and what politicians in these countries want to do. And so if you don't start with a policing structure that's intended to protect the people, that's a pretty big place to diverge. And if you're not starting with a culture that has an intent, that's what you're hoping for at the end, a lot of these police practices that are technocratic can get distorted along the way. And so if we tell you, use these reconciliation practices, there's good evidence. Well, what police structure that exists to extract money from the people to pass it up to higher ups is going to implement these reconciliation practices? So that's why we're getting at these higher level questions, is because the technical evidence base matters a lot, but you need a policing structure that wants to do them. And that's why Lawrence is saying, you have to have a parallel police structure maybe, or we're trying to come up with workarounds and reforms because, or Ziyanda is just saying, I'm moving away from policing altogether. It's hard to get the existing structures to do the things that we know work, even though our evidence base is a little low. I'll get off my soapbox.
No, thank you very much. Ziyanda.
Sure. So I mean, okay, look, spoiler alert. If anybody is in the comment section and they don't want to hear about colonialism, you should never read anything I've written. It is really, it is just, it's such a huge part of understanding any, I think, police institution, but particularly South Africa's, through colonial era and apartheid era policing, very much hand in hand in terms of that, and even now in democracy. I think to answer the original question and to try and sort of give a very solid example, both the example that Lawrence gave and that Rachel also touched on, particularly I think around what in South Africa were called street committees, as well as imbizo or sort of traditional dispute resolution mechanisms. Those actually survived, sort of long past any kind of slightly post-colonial era, and in many communities still exist today because of the fact that the police and the SAPS weren't present in communities except to brutalize anti-apartheid activists and to subjugate any sort of activism in that sense. Many communities still, don't have the requisite sort of basic policing resources or infrastructure. So those two mechanisms are still in place, and they're recognized actually in some form by the South African government and police service in terms of having created community policing forums that are meant to be part and parcel really of the way that the police operate, or at least law enforcement operates in South Africa. The very difficult nature of those CPFs is that they've also become highly politicized. Again, if we're talking about sort of institutional culture and police culture, a lot of what we've been talking about still exists, even in the sort of best or well-intentioned ideas around kind of bringing indigenous practices, forward into sort of modern day life. And those CPFs, those street committees, those sort of groups either can become vigilantes, they can have incredibly narrow purposes and they therefore can be somewhat successful, or they become co-opted by the police itself and the sort of institution and culture around that. So I'm really sorry to the person who asked the original question, but there isn't a great sort of answer that we can give, except to say that in multiple communities and countries, some form of these mechanisms exist, and there is sort of mixed evidence or results from their existence.
Thanks, Ziyanda. We've had, I'm going to try and combine a couple of questions, because so one we've got from Mauricio Quirilo in Colombia, who highlights that police reform is often attempted when there's extremely high rates of organized crime and homicide and crime overall. And Tim Heath in the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office puts a similar question about improving police reform can work to improve trust and legitimacy, but of course we have the very other real world problems of crime, and people want reductions in that. And he asked the question then, what's the evidence on improved trust leading to actual crime reduction, and how long does that causation take to show? Now I'll go to Lawrence, then Ziyanda, then Rachel.
It's hard to show that creating trust leads to greater compliance with the law on the part of those who have increased their trust or respect for the police. We took one of the central tenets of this dimension of procedural justice theory into the analysis of restorative meetings for drunk drivers in Canberra, people over the prescribed limit, through a very proactive system of detecting blood alcohol content among drivers, which had roughly 900 people arrested. Half of them were diverted to a meeting with the police and the driver's friends, and the other half were prosecuted in court in the usual way. The experiment showed that with the police officer leading this discussion, the trust in the police went up compared to the people who went to court and were prosecuted. And that was the offenders. But the offenders actually didn't have less offending after their trust in the police went up. They actually had more offending. So that's the closest thing to a direct test I know of with experimental evidence that created the condition of increased trust to see whether that would reduce criminal activity, and it went the other way. That's only one test. There could be many other tests, but I don't think the reason to create trust at the individual level in the police, or to have people feel that the police treat them fairly and effectively in protecting them from violence, I don't think the reason to create those feelings is necessarily to change the behavior of those individuals. We have to remember that most people in Britain, somewhere between 10 and 20%, would have contact of any kind with the police in a year, meaning that 80 to 90% had no contact, didn't talk to the police on the phone, didn't see a police officer on the street to talk to. There's just no interaction going on. So why is it important for a country to have a high level of trust in its police, as Britain tends to? And the United States has had declining trust since Michael Brown was killed by the Ferguson police in Missouri in 2014, bottomed out in 2020 with George Floyd. It's coming back up, with the threat to the police actually coming up, and a 63% increase in police murdered in the United States last year as part of a historic rise in homicide after this period of decline in crime and then the big jump in violence. Paradoxically, what we may be seeing is people trusting the police more because they see the police as putting themselves in harm's way, just as the Black voters in Minneapolis did, who overwhelmingly rejected the plan to abolish the police force and replace it with the Department of Public Safety. Approximately 75% of the voters in Black neighborhoods voted against this proposal. 56% of the total population voted against the proposal. But I don't think that would have happened had there not been this doubling in the number of shootings in Minneapolis in the year after George Floyd was murdered. And there had not been especially a concentration of increased murders in the African-American neighborhoods. So would the African-Americans in Minneapolis now trust the police more than they did before that happened? I don't think we have any data. I do have quotes in a New Yorker story interviewing George Floyd's friends right after he was murdered when they first heard about the defunding the police proposals, and they were horrified because of the bad actors that they knew would fill the vacuum. And as Rachel was describing it, that's the kind of problem that you face if it's all stick and no carrot. And 30% of the police force left, so there's that many fewer officers in Minneapolis. There's that much less proactive effort to get people selling and carrying guns off the street. What you get in terms of fear of crime that might drive up trust in the police as the thin blue line that protects us is a paradox, insofar as we don't necessarily want to build trust that way. We would much rather build trust in the police by having a safer society and police getting credit for it. But if you look historically at what happened in New York with an 85% drop in the homicide rate, 85%, unprecedented from 1990 through the early 2000s. As the murder threat dropped, people's willingness to support the police dropped. And they, in effect, what do we need you for anymore? The problem's fixed. So these are very complicated relationships. And I still think that liberal democracies need to have trust and confidence in the form of governance that they have, so they will resist efforts like the January 6th assault on the US Capitol. And we can avoid the loss of liberal democracy as an enlightened idea in the global North, all of which takes us not too far away from the global South, because so many of the countries, especially as we've seen in Latin America, are flip-flopping back and forth between pretty democratic to pretty autocratic situations. Think about Uruguay for the last 40 years, for example. And while they've been much happier under liberal democracy, at least according to the official counts, the murder rate has been going up substantially since they lost their authoritarian regime. I would be the last person to say that the authoritarian regime is the solution. But I would point out that having democratic freedoms and the changing view of the police in relation to how much crime there is only a part of the chaos, not only of democracy, but of the modern economy and all of the disruptions, especially now with COVID, that are going on. This is a very hard time for governance. And if we want to support the sustainability of liberal democracy, I think we need to be thinking holistically, not just about the police, but about these other elements, and especially about how we can use both carrots and sticks to make policing safer as an occupation and to make the communities that they police safer in the face of an ever-growing number of guns, certainly up and down the North and South American continents, but fortunately so far not in India.
Thanks, Lawrence. Ziyanda, over to you.
Sure. I mean, I think that there, there's a relationship obviously that exists between trust in the police and sort of their mandates, but I think also importantly, that has many other spillover effects in the way that either the police operate or function or don't in many countries. So, as I mentioned earlier, with the NSARS popular movement in Nigeria, that was specifically around brutality and corruption, around a kind of specialized unit within Nigeria. At a previous job that I worked at with Afrobarometer, we kind of looked back at survey data over 34 countries from about 2019 and 2020. And really where you saw a lot of, or very high levels of distrust in the police, or, conversely put low levels of trust in the police in many countries. Once you actually dug deeper into that and sort of asked why and how that happened, the effects that have is that people don't, report crimes, or they feel like they have to bribe police officers to do their jobs, and either investigate crimes or even sort of show up to collect evidence. And what that does is that it really sends a lot of police institutions into a kind of downward spiral, where where a lot of societies then start to accept a kind of minimum level of crime, because they believe the police either won't investigate their crime or show up, or crimes against them. They simply don't bother reporting sort of minor crimes or certain incidences, especially in South Africa. Multiple sort of surveys and inquiries have found that people just kind of, who are victims of minor robberies or muggings just want their stuff back. And if they don't believe that the police will give them their stuff back, then they'll turn to, to those groups, whether they're vigilante groups or others that they believe will. So this a lack of trust really has multiple sort of implications for how police institutions are perceived, police themselves are seen to do their job or not do their job. And that really speaks to either losses of confidence in the police or never being able to regain trust that could be there or should be there, that simply dissipates.
Thanks very much. Rachel, over to you.
I think Lawrence did a great job of really ferreting out just how complex these statistical relationships are and how careful we need to be when talking about them. When I was speaking of community trust, I was talking about what Ziyanda is talking about, which is, can you get people who have information about a crime to report information on that crime? Because we know that kind of information matters a lot. Some of the people with information on crime tend to be people who have committed crimes, particularly with regards to homicide. The people who commit homicides, people who are victims of homicide, are very similar and tend to run in the same groups. It's why there's such a strong epidemiological connection with that particular crime. But they're not always similar. And so when you get to things like property crime and so on, you get bigger gaps between victims or, drunk driving, the victims of drunk driving versus, or people who have information about it versus the offenders. So, and then there's these really difficult statistical relationships with things like reporting and so on, where we all know that reporting often goes up when trust in police goes up. So crime goes up, or it looks like it's going up when trust in police goes up because people bother to report. Rape goes up, statistically speaking, when women get more empowered and start reporting rape. Does that mean rape really goes up? We have no idea because you can't tell. And so it can be really hard to answer some of these questions. One thing that does seem likely is that police are a leading indicator of governance in general. When people don't trust government, they're unlikely to trust police, who are a very clear representation of the government in their lives. When people don't trust police, they're also less likely to trust governments. There's also a vicious cycle between that. Bo Rothstein, who does work on the quality of governance indicators, or he used to, I don't know if Bo is still there, has ferreted that out in Europe. And so, as one of the questioners wrote, when decline in institutions of government go down, which they're going down all over the world, we can expect police to lose trust. And that's a problem. But the last thing I'll say is that one of the questioners talked about the gross misrepresentation of defund the police. That's true. I actually know the folks who are behind the BLM movement, who have actually done fabulous work in America, working with really interesting and excellent groups that know a lot about police, to put together efforts to put some meat on the bones of what they're asking for, and ask for much smarter things than the people in the street. The problem is very few people are spending their lives on that website looking at the empirical evidence that they've put together. And a lot of people are looking at what's coming out of the protests and what's on the media and what keeps getting repeated in the news. And that's the case anywhere in the world. And so you need to be real careful what your slogans are and how things get repeated. And the fact is that right now there's been a very antagonistic relationship set up that is not particularly helpful to the communities being policed. And now that we're seeing, in America at least, a 30% rise in homicide last year, I think this year it's up again 5% or so. And these are historically huge rises, the once in 100 years rise. That's not hitting me. I'm an upper middle class white lady. I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, though, and New Mexico is a very violent state, and it's hitting a lot of my neighbors. So, when you look at who is being harmed by these things, the activists on the ground who are advocating really do need to be aware of how the activism and the advocacy interacts with these extremely complex measures of things like trust, because the erosion of trust in our institutions that are caused by something like a defund the police mandate or a mantra is problematic.
Thanks, Rachel. Lawrence, do you want to?
Yeah, could I just build on that by saying that the idea of having other institutions and professions, especially mental health professionals, deal with many of the problems that police don't really want to deal with, it has been very attractive. For the last 20 years, I've been listening to police leaders talk about it. And the experiments in New Mexico now, I don't know if they're controlled experiments, but they're certainly trying to create systems whereby it's possible to send somebody to an incident with someone who is having mental health problems and who might be more violent if they confront a police officer than if they confront a mental health professional. That's a hypothesis. It's a very important hypothesis. It should be tested. There are many other ways in which the incoming information about crime at a police call center could be processed through millions of prior such calls that would help to sort who should be the first responder. Should it be a police officer? Should it be a mental health worker? Should it be somebody else, maybe a neighborhood worker? It's possible that we could have a whole suite of things. And that really was the idea behind the Minneapolis proposal. But as Rachel said, if you present this as a form of punishment to the existing police professionals, it will be seen as an assault on their meaning of their lives, and they will fight very hard against it. And many people who identify with what police do will share that view. And I think that it has been terribly unfortunate that the way in which the proposal to have alternative and diverse mechanisms of dealing with community safety issues has been translated into a let's get rid of policing, end of policing narrative, which preceded the defund the policing movement. I think that is a challenge, and that if it comes down to get rid of police, get rid of schools because we don't like what they teach about history, or whatever other challenges we can have to the institutions that create certainty and the foundations of liberal democracy, that may be one of the reasons trust in government is going down around the world, because of this lack of confidence that the government can restore some sense of certainty, even in the global north. But I think it's even more important then to think about, why don't we do these kinds of alternative responses, or even alternative proactive strategies for other institutions to be coordinated with the police, working as partners, but not necessarily to think that we should get the police to do everything, instead of having a more differentiated strategy in a culture that's eating strategy for breakfast.
Great, yeah, thanks. I've got a question which is going to take us a little bit outside the police ecosystem, and you've all rightly suggested we need to do that. And it is, how can we encourage social movements, particularly amongst middle class, upper class, but I think the question could be expanded, with voting influence, to change their mindsets towards showing force by police. Essentially, how do we get support for police reform in social movements? A big question. We don't have the great much time. So I'm going to go to Ziyanda and Rachel and then Lawrence, and then we'll wrap up for the evening.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great question. And, you know, sort of broadly speaking, maybe Rachel and Lawrence know more, but I don't necessarily know of sort of kind of solid evidence that, or maybe from controlled evaluations that might exist. But just sort of zoning in on the South African example, I think that in many ways, a fair amount of dysfunction within the police, as well as the last 2 years of an incredibly harsh lockdown in South Africa, have made South Africans rethink, you know, their thoughts on policing. These moments have also happened before, with for example, the Marikana massacre in 2012. Where 34 striking miners were killed by the police, and that, you know, created a national reckoning around what we want to see our police officers do in their day-to-day jobs, as well as the roads must fall and fees must fall movements in 2015 and 2016 that saw, you know, students on campuses trying to sort of fight for fee reduction and decolonized education. And again, that really brought to the fore the conversation around policing, and you know, what people sort of perceive that to be, well, not even perceive it to be, but what they actually want the police to do in terms of whether it is maintaining law and order or sort of public order. So it's in and of themselves, I think that in countries like South Africa, you know, where there is a fair amount of social unrest at any kind of given point, that can turn into social movements that make us question what it is, you know, we want from the police, or why police institutions exist in the way that they do, and whether they have to change. Again, that's not a kind of neat answer, but I think in many ways, catalyzing or sort of working within energy of kind of catalyst events around community safety, public safety, in the cases that I mentioned, economic and racial justice as well. You know, they bring everyone to the table, and you know, in discussing what a future either with a sort of competent police service looks like, or one beyond policing might look like as well.
Thank you, Ziyanda. We've got a couple of minutes left. I think we've got time for Rachel, for you to have a crack at that one.
Sure. So I think Erica Chenoweth at Harvard is probably the best scholar on social movements. And she's found a couple of things, Erica and Maria Stefan both. Broad-based social movements have the most likelihood of succeeding, and broad-based matters because they need to have application across a polarized society. Often policing happens in violent places where you've got highly polarized societies. So getting a lot of people all from one side, whether it's one side of a racial fissure, an economic fissure, or a geographic fissure, is much, much less helpful than getting a variety of people from across the society, because that shows that this is a problem that the governing structure has to deal with. It's not something that they can ignore because it doesn't affect their voting base, if it's a democracy, or if it's an autocracy, that they can ignore because it doesn't affect key parts of the community. So broad-based is really important. To get broad-based, you need to have nonviolence. Violence tends to scare away a lot of people from joining movements. It makes them terrified of joining. It also makes them more militant. And it also is very important to have not to have violent flanks. This is something that's been changing in recent years. A lot more social movements have been happening. We're seeing unprecedented numbers of protests around the world. But those protests have been much less successful than they used to be. Erica's got really interesting data on this. And there's many reasons for this. One is that the autocrats are probably learning a lot. But the other seems to be that the recent movements tend to have violent flanks that are getting allowed more. It takes a lot of discipline and a lot of training to maintain nonviolence. You really have to teach people that nonviolence is not about giving in. It's not about being kind of namby-pamby or turning the other cheek. It's actually a technique to win broad-based support, and also to make the regime look as bad as possible, and to get defectors from the regime, which is really how you end up changing. And so violent flanks really harm movements, and we're seeing more of them. And the last thing about social movements is that you really want a politics of respectability. This has been really maligned by the left, particularly lately, that there's this desire to, we should be able to be what we want to be, and we shouldn't have to follow the kind of respectable nature of whatever society is demanding, particularly when society itself is problematic. I understand that emotionally, but if you want a broad-based social movement that appeals to many, many people, who particularly appeals to the people in power that you're trying to get to defect, and to speak less abstractly, you want the police to be on your side, right? You want as many police as possible to be on your side when you're trying to reform the police. If the police are part of a military structure, you need parts of the military on your side. You cannot show up in green hair and looking like a hippie, or you have to look like the people that you're trying to get to be on your side. It's why the civil rights movement insisted on people showing up in ties and skirts and so on. It's really important, because you're trying to convince the very people that you're trying to reform that you're not so scary. And so social movements that are trying to alter the way the middle class or the upper middle class think need to be broad-based, non-violent, no violent flanks, and probably employ politics or respectability to get there. And it's still really hard. It's not, it's not easy to build a social movement. You're trying to keep a lot of people in line, but it has been done. In America, we had a very major criminal justice reform. It really mattered. It still it has a long way to go, but it really mattered. And it was exactly all this. We brought the Koch brothers together with the far left to really change our criminal justice system. That's broad-based, completely nonviolent, and so on. And so, these things can work, but they're hard.
Thank you,
Real
Rachel.
quick, a police professional social movement called the Societies of Evidence-Based Policing, founded in Britain, now active in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States. Nascent in some other countries, one in the global south, where it was kind of pushed back because it sounds like a police union, which it's not. But when you have the police themselves saying, we've got to do better, and we got to act based on evidence, but we've got to defend human rights, that's a different kind of professional social movement, and one that I think is going to have increasing influence on police reform in the years to come.
Thank you, Lawrence. That's a positive note to end on. Thank you so much to my guests. You've been brilliant. It's been both comparative and you've talked us through the evidence, and you've been entertaining as well. So my profound thanks from the LSE. Thank you to the audience, and yes, I'll bid you good evening. Let's hope we can all make a bit of a difference to reforming police.
Thank you.